We have been looking at, since the beginning of this semester, at the long 19th century, roughly 1770s or 1780s in the case of the Russian Empire, but certainly ending in 1914, that long historic 19th century. And up until now, we've been focusing very specifically on the Russian-ruled Ukrainian lands, imperial Russian-ruled Ukrainian lands, or the Dnieper Ukraine. Today we begin a series of 4 lectures that will focus on that other empire that ruled Ukrainian lands in this long historic 19th century, and that was Austria Hungary. Present-day Western Ukraine, we look at the present-day borders of Ukraine, in particular lands north of the Carpathian Mountains, became part of Habsburg-ruled Austria. Very specifically as a result of the international power struggle in Central Europe that led to the first partition of Poland in the year 1772. So technically our period in Western Ukrainian lands begins in 1772. Justification for this acquisition. Every power has to justify why they take territory from somebody else. And of course, we know that history is very useful in this regard. Call upon history and we can justify anything. The Habsburgs, using the medieval Hungarian claim to the Galician-Volhynian kingdom. Galicia-Volhynia existed as a kingdom during the medieval period within the framework of the Rus state of Kiev, or the Kievan Rus. And at some point, the Hungarian kings, way back in the 12th century, claimed the kingdom, added it to their crown. And as we're going to see, the Austrian Habsburgs, later on, precisely in the 16th century, became the hereditary kings of Hungary. And therefore, from their perspective, they simply reacquired what they officially designated now as the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, or for short, Galicia, the Kingdom of Galicia. 2 years later, at the close of the Russo-Turkish War of 1774, Austria took advantage of that war, defeating the Ottomans. The Ottomans were in a weakened position, and they simply seized a mountainous area or mountainous region known as Bukovyna, which, if we look on this map, is not even marked. It's a tiny little place here, but on this map here we have Galicia, and down here Bukovyna. Hence, Galicia and Bukovyna are now within the framework of the Austrian lands. There, of course, was one other territory that is within present-day Ukraine. It had been a part of the Habsburg realm well before 1772, and this was Transcarpathia, which is on down here. Transcarpathia, or as it's known in the 20th century, Subcarpathian Rus, or this period of time known as Hungarian Rus, it continued to remain an integral part of the Hungarian kingdom. So now we have these 3 territories that we're going to be talking about, most particularly Galicia and Bukovyna in the Austrian lands, Transcarpathia in the Hungarian kingdom, within this eventually empire called Austria Hungary. But what was this Austria, or the Austro-Hungarian, or the Austrian Empire? And now we have a larger number of Ukrainians who found themselves in this state during the last quarter of the 18th century. Well, in a sense, this realm was a kind of relic from the Middle Ages, a time when royal families acquired territories as part of their personal patrimony. The family in question were these Habsburgs, who date way back to the 13th century from Germanic territories in present-day Austria, to the south of Austria, Switzerland, and Carniola, Styria down here. This family eventually made its base at a place called Vienna, which I'm sure you all have heard about, on the middle Danube River, and from there gradually expanded their rule until by the period we're talking about, the late 18th century, Habsburg possessions were, at least in territorial size, second only to the Russian Empire within the framework of Europe. Just to give you some idea of its extent, Habsburg territory at the end of the 18th century comprised what is today the entire countries of Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, also substantial portions of Romania, particularly this area called Transylvania, portion of Serbia, an area called the Vojvodina, parts of Poland, parts of Ukraine, this historic Galicia, and also Italy. Much of northern Italy, as you can see on this map from the period, was under Habsburg rule. So all of the Italian north, places like Lombardy and Venice, Parma, even as far south as Tuscany and Florence, all of this belonged to the Habsburg realm. On the other hand, the Habsburgs were going to lose most of these Italian lands in the late 19th century, but then at the beginning of the 20th century, it was to gain another territorial called Bosnia-Herzegovina, which today is, in fact, an independent state. Enormous territory. The inhabitants of the Habsburg domain were as diverse as the territories. The major languages, note I say major languages spoken, were German, Hungarian, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Ukrainian, Slovenian, Serbo-Croatian, Serbian, Croatian, two separate languages now, Romanian, Italian. As I said, these were only the major languages, which by the late 19th century, those 10 languages even appeared on the empire's paper money. So Ukrainian actually appeared as an official language on the money of a state. But then aside from these, there were numerous other languages, including Yiddish, Romani, Armenian. So now we see the size. What was the administrative structure of this empire? Well, initially it was very complex. And why was that? Because each new territory that was acquired over the centuries, and this goes back to effectively starting in the 12th and 13th centuries, each new territory that was added, it could be a kingdom, it could be a grand duchy or duchy, simply just a city. More often than not, each of those elements retained its own traditional customs and administration. Now, the most distinct territory, because it was the largest and for the most part self-governing, was the Hungarian kingdom. And on this particular map, which is the early part of the 19th century, this was the Hungarian kingdom. And if we're looking at the pale blue, it's clearly the dominant or the most largest component of the Austrian Habsburg realm. Hungary had been a very important kingdom in the medieval period, but in the 16th century, it suffered a major defeat by the Ottoman Empire. Its king was killed, and it was during that time that the Habsburgs then became kings of Hungary, as well as the rulers of the Austrian lands. Throughout this whole period, the Hungarians had this problematic relationship with the Austrian rulers in Vienna. And actually, it was not until the year 1867, our period, that the Hungarian kingdom finally acquired virtually self-governing status. And so it is only really from that period, from the year 1867, that the term Austro-Hungarian Empire, or dual monarchy as it was known, should be properly used. So we have Austrian lands, we have the Hungarian kingdom, then we have the Austrian Empire, and then finally it becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Though these terms slip a lot of times. Sometimes I'll slip too and say the Austro-Hungarian Empire at a time when it didn't technically exist. Now, Galicia and Bukovyna and its inhabitants belonged to the non-Hungarian portion of the Austrian realm. Actually, this non-Hungarian part of the realm did not really even have a name. Rather, it was simply a conglomerate of historic territories or provinces, and you can see them on this map: Bohemia, Moravia, all of those Austrian provinces, Upper and Lower Austria, Salzburg, Styria, Tyrol, down in the Balkan area, Croatia, Slavonia, which is part of Hungary, pardon, but Dalmatia. And then, of course, in the far northeast, we now have Galicia and Bukovyna. And as I mentioned, those Italian provinces were still part of the empire, but were lost in 1860. But lacking any name, historic literature often refers to all of these provinces as Austria, or the Austrian half of the Habsburg Empire, even though it has nothing to do with modern-day Austria, which was only one small component of all of these Austrian lands. Now, many of these lands or provinces had their own assemblies. Those assemblies were made up of representatives from three social estates: the clergy, the magnates, and the gentry landowners. Each of those social estates struggled to preserve a degree of local autonomy. It's always the sense of local autonomy vis-a-vis the imperial rulers, especially when the empire grew in size with regard to its bureaucracy and its central administration in the imperial capital of Vienna. At the head of that administration was the monarch, always a hereditary member of the Habsburg family, assisted by several governing boards known as chancelleries. All appointees to these chancelleries were made by the emperor, who in effect was the ultimate authority in this autocratic Austrian state. Now, as for Hungary, it had its own diet, elected by the nobility of the country, although its authority over the Hungarian kingdom varied depending on the political fortune of the Hungarians vis-a-vis the Habsburg central administration in Vienna, and we'll see how those fortunes continually changed. I've just given you a kind of brief overview of the structure of the a Habsburg realm. And I don't want to leave you with the impression of a kind of motley conglomerate of territories and peoples that may have seemed to be held together simply by military force or more likely by political inertia. There were indeed several factors which contributed to a sense of unity within this heterogeneous realm. Moreover, the number and influence of what we can call integrating socio-political factors actually increased in the course of our historic 19th century. And some of those integrating factors prevailed to the very end of the empire in 1918, some continuing to exist even after the empire's demise. And what were these integrating factors? Well, first and foremost, there was the Habsburg bureaucracy. Bureaucracies is really what holds any state together. And when the leadership of states go away, the bureaucracies usually remain because the rulers have to depend on somebody to run the place, so to speak. So, integrating factors, Habsburg bureaucracy, which actually became an efficient and even honest, if sometimes overbearing. You couldn't do anything unless you had the stamp. Didn't make a difference what, you had to have the stamp from some bureaucrat. Other factors contributing to this sense of unity were the legal system, which upheld the rule of law, the army, in which every male had to serve, and the schools, which provided universal and compulsory education, at least at the elementary level. All of these institutions, the bureaucracy, the legal system, the army, the schools, promoted a sense of what we can call imperial Habsburg patriotism among the empire's inhabitants. German was the official language of the administration and the upper levels of education. And it's in that sense that German became a kind of lingua franca, common mode of communication, for those elements of the population, administrators, intellectuals, merchants, artisans, even some peasants, who needed a means of communication that could be understood by other citizens of the empire, of these various languages that we spoke about. At another level, there were certain symbols of imperial culture that became entrenched in the psyches of the empire's inhabitants. Architecture was one such tangible symbol. Even today, there are portions of cities as far away as Milan in northern Italy, Budapest in Hungary, Bratislava in Slovakia, Krakow in Poland, Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Lviv and Chernivtsi in Ukraine, which are indistinguishable from each other, as well as from the buildings in the imperial capital in Vienna. So sometimes you can stand in the middle of one of these cities and you look around, then you can go to another one. It all looks the same. Every one of these cities, very important in this actually cultured empire, was a theater. So in the last decades of the 19th century, on the main square of every one of these cities is a theater. And they all almost look the same, whether it's in Bratislava or Krakow or wherever. And at the more popular level, the waltzes of the Strauss family, the operettas of Johann Strauss Jr. and the Hungarian-born Franz Lehár, and Emmerich Kálmán, provided in a very real sense, quote unquote, the national music of the empire, since the melodies from these operettas were probably as well known to all the inhabitants of the empire as was their local folk music. And finally, the Habsburg rulers themselves became undeniable symbols of unity, in some cases close to national heroes for each of the empire's peoples. This was certainly the case with regard to the 18th century rulers, which we're going to look at, Maria Teresa and Joseph II, and even Franz Joseph, who ruled from 1848 to 1916, a remarkable 68 years. And this was a time of nationalist fervor and passion and conflict, ideological conflict, between the nationalities themselves and certainly the nationalities vis-a-vis the central authorities. That was the time when he ruled, and even still, he became, for many inhabitants, an imperial Austrian symbol to be respected, even revered, above the national and social conflicts of the late chronological 19th century. The point of all of this is that despite its enormous heterogeneity, the Austrian Empire succeeded in creating a sufficient number of unifying and integrative elements so that Habsburg rule became an acceptable social and political framework for most of the inhabitants up to, and I might even say, after the outbreak of World War I in 1914. So much then for the Habsburg realm as a whole. Galicia and Bukovyna, the two lands in present-day Western Ukraine, together with their East Slavic Ukrainian inhabitants, actually known officially at the time as Ruthenians, we'll see why in a moment. So, Galicia and Bukovyna entered the Austrian realm at a very favorable time in its history. Why? Well, at the very end of the previous century, the 17th century, very specifically in 1699, the Habsburgs had finally driven the Ottoman Turks out of territory that was formerly either under Hungary or Austria. So it got back all of the Hungarian kingdom. Remember, just a few years before, the Ottomans made it to Vienna and almost captured Vienna. Didn't quite do it. Certainly Budapest a long time ago, but not Vienna. But finally in 1699, there is no longer an immediate threat from the Ottoman Empire in the south. And as a result of that, already from the outset of our 18th century, the 1700s, the Habsburgs could now turn to consolidating their authority within their lands. But to accomplish this, reforms were needed. Reforms in order to make the antiquated social and administrative structure of the empire more functional. Remember I said that these lands were added ever since the Middle Ages, and each of them were different. And they were somewhat dysfunctional within the empire. And so reforms were needed, and they were carried out by two of Austria's most dynamic and talented rulers, again, Empress Maria Teresa and her son, Joseph the Second. Joseph actually became co-regent with his mother in 1763, and so many of the reforms that were subsequently adopted were adopted even before he ruled in his own right. And for this reason, the whole reform period is sometimes simply known as the Josephine era, but it really more properly the Teresan Josephine era. Both sovereigns were enlightened rulers, each of whom was convinced that the good of society as a whole depended on the proper functioning of the state. And in turn, a successful state depended on the ability of each inhabitant to serve the state. In that sense, each person had a role to play in the imperial system. By the way, it was in this context that Emperor Joseph II always liked to quip and describe himself as simply the first servant of the state. I'm here working for the state like all the rest of you. And because it was during the last years of Maria Teresa, and especially under Joseph II, that Galicia became part of the Habsburg Empire, the enlightened Austrian theory of government now could be applied to its new territory. Now, this new territory was like a tabula rasa. Now we're going to put all these reforms in place and see what happens. Just a few data on size. In 1772, this year when Galicia was acquired, the Kingdom of Galicia comprised 83,000 square miles. The area had 2.8 million inhabitants. And those inhabitants were more or less divided along the San River. You know your maps, so you know where the San River is. Relatively small river, but very important. Why? Because if we look at this map, the shading outlined by this red are where ethnic Ukrainians, Ruthenians live, in terms of the majority population. And here's the San River. So more or less, the eastern part of this province of Galicia was where Ruthenians, Ukrainians live. West of the San River was primarily where Poles lived. So that's the general importance of the San River, which is more or less, in part still today, the actual international boundary between Poland and Ukraine. Bukovyna also kind of ethnically divided. The northwestern portion of Bukovyna inhabited primarily by these Ruthenian Ukrainians. The southern portion by Romanians, because it was adjacent to Romanian territories of Moldova, or Moldavia. Aside from Ruthenians or Poles, there were large numbers of Jews and also Austro-German bureaucrats, most particularly in the cities. In terms of religious identity, also very important because in many ways religious identity what coincided with one's ethno-linguistic identity. In that sense, Poles were almost exclusively Roman Catholic. The Ruthenians in Galicia, and for that matter in Transcarpathia, were Greek Catholic, or Byzantine Rite Catholic, Eastern Rite Catholic. On the other hand, the Ruthenians in Bukovyna, just like the Romanians in Bukovyna, were Orthodox. With regard to the basic social structure of Galicia, it was overwhelmingly agrarian. Actually 87% of the population lived in rural areas, and of that population in rural areas, 72% comprised peasant serfs. Another important element, certainly within Galicia, was the Polish Szlachta, or as we know, nobility. At the beginning of our period in 1772, they numbered 95,000, 3.4% of the population. Now, since this was an era of reform in the Habsburg Empire, when Galicia was acquired, the former Polish administrative system, because Galicia was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was entirely dismantled. Already after 1786, Austrian laws replaced Polish ones. Effectively, all political power was now in the hands of the emperor's appointee, the governor of Galicia, who ruled with his administration from the administrative capital of Galicia, which was the city of Lviv, which you know from your map, and otherwise known at this time by its German name, Lemberg. Lviv, Lemberg, or as the Poles would say, Lwów. Now, the reforms initiated by the Habsburg rulers were actually intended to apply throughout the empire and to affect all walks of life. The object being to transform Austria into a modern and rational, remember we're in the Enlightenment here, a rational bureaucratic state or bureaucratized state. And so, throughout the 1770s, internal tariffs that were left over from medieval times were abolished. Criminal procedures were regulated. Torture was abolished. An edict of toleration applicable to all religions was adopted. The educational system completely restructured. We'll look at some of these elements in more detail in a moment. Galicia's nobility and its peasantry was also deeply affected by these Theresian Josephine reforms. Most importantly, the previously all-dominant position of the Polish Szlachta, the Polish nobility, came to an end. In particular, their tax-exempt status was ended. Now, this was the greatest blow of all, but after all, they're just subjects of the emperor like everybody else. And therefore, the nobility was subject to Austrian law, which, by the way, provided for no personal and property guarantees comparable to what the Szlachta nobility had under the old Polish Commonwealth. In effect, at that time, and in that structure, the Polish nobility was, for all intents and purposes, above the law, no longer under the Habsburgs. The peasantry. Already under Maria Teresa, the service obligations of the proprietary peasants were strictly defined, and that then alleviated their dependence on the arbitrary will of the landlord. The state stepped in, said, you know, okay, there are requirements that proprietary peasants need to do, but we're going to fix them, and not any landlord can change them, increase them at will. Actually, Joseph II went even further, and in 1781, he actually abolished proprietary serfdom. The peasant was now free to marry, to change his or her occupation, to leave the land, provided he or she could find a replacement. And moreover, the peasant had the right to justice in courts which were no longer in the hands of the Polish landlords, but rather state functionaries sent by Vienna. Now, it's also true that the peasants, as a result of these reforms, turned out to be subjected to even heavier taxes and to long-term compulsory military service. And because the landlords were expected to make provision for collecting the taxes and supplying the military recruits, they still had a role to play. And soon it was the peasants who viewed those landlords as an evil force. They juxtaposed these evil nobles who in their minds were the bad guys, juxtaposing them to the good and understanding emperor in Vienna. So the Habsburgs were good, the local nobles were bad. That was the view of the peasants. Now, the economic situation for Galicia in general was much less favorable than a lot of what I've been saying so far, and that's because of Austria's general economic policies. They adopted a particular brand of an economic theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism. What did that mean? Well, first of all, this was the opposite of laissez-faire economics. It's the state that directed the economy, but the state of that economy, or the state, was kind of based on the idea of autarky, that the state should be self-functioning within itself. It didn't need the outside world. And basically that meant that the agricultural eastern part of the empire remained a supplier of raw materials, and in particular agricultural products, and they supplied the highly industrialized provinces in the western part, like Bohemia, Moravia, Lower Austria. Clearly, Galicia and Hungarian Kingdom were in the eastern agricultural zone, as a result of which industrialization in those regions was not encouraged. Now, in principle, this was a reasonable system, if you look at the Austrian Empire as a whole, but in practice, Galicia became a kind of internal colony of the western provinces. And the ongoing maintenance of the serf structure and the traditional control of the agricultural sector by the Polish landlords worked against any modernization or increase in agricultural productivity. And so the Galician economy did not advance, and the peasant masses remained, for all intents and purposes, at a subsistence level. So much for the socioeconomic elements and structure of the Austrian realm, the Austrian Empire. Now, a few words before we leave about nationalism and the national awakening, at least up to the key year 1848, which we'll see is a key year, dead center in the middle of our long historic 19th century. So now, from the 1770s to 1848, the outbreak of revolution, these were marked, those years, those decades, by a kind of national awakening, was the term used at the time, among these Ruthenians or Ukrainians in the Habsburg realm. During those 75-odd years, the Ruthenians, Ukrainians in the Austrian portion of the empire basically went through the first heritage gathering stage of intelligentsia-inspired national movements. Although they also experienced some aspects of the second organizational stage. That was mostly possible because of the help and encouragement offered by the Austrian imperial government. 1772, the Austrians take this territory, or are given it, or it is returned to them from this long hiatus from the Middle Ages in which the Poland occupied it. So it's now returned to the Habsburg, so to speak. And they send out officials to check this place out. What is this place? And the Austrian officials who entered the province in 1772 sent back reports in which they made it clear to the imperial authorities in Vienna that the population living roughly in the eastern half of this new province, and as you can see there, that population was, in terms of religion and language, different both from the Poles as well as from the Russians in the east. Why do we even mention Russians in the east? Well, that's because that local Ruthenian Ukrainian population call themselves in their own language Ruski. Ruski. They also use the old Cyrillic alphabet or the Slavonic alphabet in their publications and in their religious life and cultural life. But clearly, according to the reports, these people weren't Russian, and so the Viennese government did not designate them as Ruthen, or Russen, which would be the German equivalent of Russian, but rather as Ruthenen, which in English is rendered most often as Ruthenian. In fact, this ethnonym Ruthenian was the only official designation given to East Slavs, Ukrainians living in the Habsburg Empire until the very end of the Habsburg Empire in 1918. That's why I'll be using the term Ruthenian sometimes as a synonym of Ukrainian. Okay, so the Viennese officials determined who the Ruthenians were not. Okay? They weren't Russians and they weren't Poles. Okay, so we know who they're not, but that did little in helping to answer who they actually were. And it was this search for a positive identity and the need to express that identity through a literary language that would preoccupy the local intelligentsia during this national awakening up until 1848. Now, the national movement among Ruthenians, Ukrainians received its first stimulus as a result of the Teresan Josephine reforms in religion and in education. Now, since these Ruthenians, Ukrainians were almost all members of the Uniat, or Greek Catholic Church, these were initially synonyms, Uniat, Greek Catholic. So they're all Eastern Christians, Eastern Rite Christians. And because of that, the organizational status of that church would have a direct impact on the Ruthenians, Ukrainians themselves. Joseph II, who was co-regent with his mother, when Galicia was acquired, felt that all the rights within the Catholic Church, and that meant the Roman Rite, the Byzantine Greek Rite, and for that matter, the Armenian Rite, which was a special one, and there were Armenians living in the empire, that all of these rights should be considered equal, or as he said, as three daughters of one mother, drei Töchter einer Mutter. This was particularly an improvement for the Greek Catholic Church, because even if under the previous Polish Commonwealth it was de jure equal to Roman Catholic Church, in practice it was treated as a poor cousin with limited financial and social possibilities. Now, however, the Austrians had secularized much of the church's property, had made all religions equally dependent upon the state. This is what you do in a bureaucratic state. Treat everybody equal. And by the way, in this context, symbolically, the hierarchy of this Eastern Rite Church requested in 1773 that the term uniat be dropped, since they felt it was derogatory, and it certainly was derogatory in the terminology of the Orthodox. And from then on, it was known as the Greek Catholic Church, probably one of the silliest and worst terms chosen. Greek Catholic Church, they're not Greeks, right? It's really the Byzantine Rite Catholic Church, or Byzantine Greek, it should have been. But we're stuck with this term Greek Catholic, who are not Greeks. But they are these Eastern Christians in union with Rome. And then in 1807, the Vatican approved Austria's request for the restoration of an independent metropolitanate, that is the highest level, well beyond a diocese or an eparchy or an archdiocese. Now we have a higher structure, a metropolitanate. And so these Greek Catholics of Galicia had their own metropolitan see with its seat in Lviv. Austrian policy also had an impact on education. Maria Theresa's decree of 1777 provided for the establishment of 3 types of schools, and then Joseph II supplemented this reform in 1781 by making elementary education compulsory for all subjects of the empire. And the education was to be in the vernacular, the spoken language of the inhabitants, certainly at the elementary level. And then, when we talk at the more advanced level, special provisions were made to train prospective Greek Catholic clergy. In 1775, again at the height of this reform period, the Austrian government opened in Vienna, the imperial capital, a Greek Catholic seminary attached to the Church of St. Barbara, and hence that seminary came to be known as the Barbareum, as the Barbareum. This institution was important not only for the theological training it provided, but also because it was, or it did expose young Ruthenians, Ukrainians from both halves of the empire to the secular intellectual world of Vienna, as well as to the more culturally advanced Slavic peoples like the Czechs, the Slovenes, the Serbs, who had also come to the imperial capital to study. So this was a kind of wonderful place for all of the peoples of the empire to be and interact. By the way, the Barbareum was in the dead center of old Vienna, where all the great churches were. And they were exposed to the popular music of the time. And what was the popular music of the time? And the people who walked those same streets, and you could hear the music. Well, those composers were Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Ludwig van Beethoven. This now was the environment in which we have these sons of priests from Galicia coming. Very important in terms of creating a sense of the value of who we are and that we are being treated equally within the framework of this empire. Let me stop here, and we will return with a few more words about this revival before we move to the revolution of 1848. Thank you.